So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fifth CRAM annual lecture. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Peter Wilson from Oxford University, who will be talking today on the European fiscal military system and the nationalisation of war, 1530 to 1870. Before I hand over to Peter, I just want to hand over to Elwen, our head of faculty, for a few words.
Thank you very much indeed, Leighton. I mean, one of the great joys of my new job and I tend to say whatever I am because it's a very long title, and I was always brought up to believe that the longer the title, the less the actual significance of the role, and I think that's probably true. But it is wonderful to join you, to sit and listen in an event such as this one. Professor Peter Wilson is someone whose work I have enjoyed, and so it is a particular pleasure to leave university structuring, restructuring, and charts for this, that, and the other to come and actually enjoy a lecture on something which is of particular interest to me. Although I'm a lawyer, my heart is actually in history. And so, thank you so much for the invitation, Thomas. Enormously appreciated. And just having the opportunity to connect with what universities are really about, rather than sort of management and all of those sorts of data-driven engagements that one can end up spending altogether too much time doing. This sort of event absolutely matters. The CRAM crew, Conflict, Reconstruction and Memory research group, brings together a really exciting mix of scholars: history, politics, I think, IR, classics, media, war and society, English, and I'm also going to give a shout out to one of my colleagues from law. It's lovely to see Gareth here as well, but it goes to show the true interdisciplinary nature of this research group, and very much is the direction of travel that I hope we will all be engaging with as the faculty, the new faculty structure develops. And so, fabulous, thanks for the invitation. I think, if I'm right, that the annual lecture series started in 2015, and there have been an exceptionally distinguished list of speakers, and we add another one to their number today. Thank you. A very warm welcome to everyone obviously here, and in particular to Professor Peter Wilson. Thank you, Leighton. Over to you again.
Thanks for that, Elwen. So to introduce Peter, he's the titular Professor of History at All Souls College, Oxford, and his research interests are primarily in the history of war from the 17th century up until the late 19th century. He has an extensive list of publications. I'll just mention a couple of them. The Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 Years of History. Europe's Tragedy, A History of the 30 Years' War, a book that won numerous awards, and most recently, Lutzen, an analysis of a key battle during the conflict. And he's currently the principal investigator on a European Research Council funded project, the European Fiscal-Military System, 1530 to 1870. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Peter.
Right, well, thank you very much for such a lovely warm welcome. It's a great pity that I can't actually be in Swansea today, but I see you have got the same wonderful weather that I've got here too, so at least we're all sharing that. It's a great pleasure to speak tonight, and I'm really very pleased that it is such an interdisciplinary audience, because that's really part of what this project that I'm going to be talking about is trying to do, is trying to sort of use history as a means to comment on current events, as well as obviously to open up some historical questions and to explore these in greater detail. So I'm just going to see if I can get the technology to work and share a screen. So yeah, that's looking reasonably good. Let's see. Right. Okay, great, good. So on this slide that you can see there, this is an event in Paris in 1830 during the the Second French Revolution, and we're going to come back to this incident later on in the talk. You'll also see there, just at the bottom, there's indication of the web address. So do please check out the project when you have time. We've already got open access publications. We also have a massive bibliography, which may be of interest. And you'll see that we're also funded from the European Research Council. So I'm formally acknowledging my gratitude to them. Without their support, this wouldn't be possible. This is really quite a large project. So it's very exciting to lead. There's myself, 6 postdoctoral researchers and an administrator, and off and on people have joined the project as it's been going, but it started in August of 2018, so we're about halfway through of this 5-year project. So just to sort of set the scene of what we're trying to do, what we're really trying to do is to build on the work that's been done already. We're not really trying to overturn existing approaches. What we are filling a gap to some extent. Essentially what we're trying to do is to evaluate the significance of non-indigenous resources to European states and the state system and the way in which warfare was resourced across the time frame. But we're also trying to develop something in addition to that, which is just to try to find an analytical framework that allows us to explore many things which have been looked at already, but have been looked at separately and haven't really been brought in together. So to make sense of a lot of disparate individual studies by shifting the focus and shifting the perspective and looking at things in a different way. In particular, we're building on 2 models of the state. These are the fiscal-military state and the contractor state. These are ideas that have grown up since the 1980s. And they've greatly extended our understanding of the way in which European states responded to the challenges of warfare from early modernity onwards. They're not incompatible approaches. They're both really examining 2 sides of the same coin. The fiscal-military state idea highlights institutional growth and revenue raising and tends to see the strength of the state as demonstrated by its ability to raise money and the institutions for that. The contractor state is focused rather more on spending that money. It looks at whether the reliance on private enterprise, or what we would now today tend to call private enterprise, private contractors, market forces, provide a superior way of mobilizing resources than relying on nationalized production. So both of these, as I say, focus on the state, and they tend to assume that states strive for autarky, and they also assume that this is generally desirable. They offer ways, I would say, of investigating the demand side of the equation. In other words, what the state wanted, and they tend to neglect whether the state got what it wanted. They both tend to assume that if you have the money, you will then find the resources. And our hypothesis is, in fact, to challenge that aspect of it at least. And our idea is that the European states system, which is seen as inherently belligerent and competitive, in fact relied on cooperation to evolve and to develop. States, we are arguing, are not autarkic actors, at least not in our time frame, and they were not necessarily just simply engaged in a Darwinian struggle of the survival of the fittest. In fact, their emergence was codependent and entailed developing ways of obtaining what they wanted from beyond their own jurisdictions. And this really is the paradox of European history. Competition was only possible through cooperation, and not just cooperation with allies, but also with neutrals and sometimes even with enemies, because states rarely obtained all that they needed from warfare from their own populations, while governments were equally have been generally unable to prevent their populations engaging in military activities elsewhere, what's usually referred to as extraterritorial violence. And our approach is to decenter the conventional historical perspective, to shift it away from political capitals and away from the sovereign state more broadly, and instead to examine how resources were acquired and how these transactions were affected by looking at them through urban hubs, cities that emerged as points in Europe where this type of business were done, that were centers for expertise, also of resource accumulation and sometimes also production. We've got 6 case studies, you can see them on the sheet there. So we have Amsterdam, which is really the premier fiscal military hub for most of the time frame, London, which ultimately displaces it just as the system is being dismantled, Vienna, which is the main hub for Central and parts of East Central Europe. And these are, of course, major cities in major sovereign states, but we're also looking at Geneva and Genoa, which were autonomous cities. And in addition, we're looking at a number of points in the Baltic. You've got 3 of them marked on the map, but we're looking more broadly at the Baltic as a region to try to see, to get a sort of regional perspective too. And that was one of the things that emerged in the course of our work. We're working both quantitatively and qualitatively, and especially we're trying to compile several long-running sets of sequential data. So we are very fortunate in that we have the sound toll data now digitized, and we can access this. So this tracks the flow of every ship leaving and entering the Baltic, often giving its destination and detailing the cargo. So for example, we can track the inflows and outflows of war materials. And we're also trying to track the movement of personnel, military personnel, and attached to that finance through the various contracts that were raised for different types of foreign soldier. And I'll be saying a bit more about that later on. And we're in order to make this somewhat more manageable, we're grouping war-making resources under 6 asset categories. So these are, first of all, personnel. So this is foreign military and naval personnel who are recruited into armies and navies, who numerically were very important. So up to 50% or so of the strength of certain forces at different times were recruited from foreigners. So this is really something that was highly important. We're looking also at expertise. This is more individual, who is hired for their specialist expertise or skills, information and intelligence, finance and credit, including loans, obviously, war materials. So in the more obvious sense, obviously, of munitions, weaponry, but also assets such as horses or grain, if they were being used for to sustain warfare. And lastly, facilities and services. So the sort of access to the type of facilities that you can see there, where you have English and Dutch ships loading at a port, but also warehouses, for example, prisons, rights of transit across territorial waters and territory. So these are our sort of this is when I'm talking about war-making resources, this is what I mean. And in addition to that, we're looking at a variety of actors. Obviously, states are very important to the story, but also a variety of semi-sovereign actors and what we would now today call non-state actors. And of course, defining what all these different groups were has taken up much of the initial stages of the project. So what I want to do now is to try to give you some sense across time of how this developed and matures and then is ultimately dismantled, and some of the reasoning for that, to give you a kind of whistle-stop tour really of the whole arc of what we're looking at. And in doing so, I hope that will reveal something of its broader significance. So when we're trying to work out, well, why does this happen when it does? And there's obviously a multiplicity of reasons. If you look at any historical phenomena, you can trace it back and you can find some kind of precursor and so on. So we want to avoid that kind of search for the very first aspect of something, and rather to look at a coincidence of a number of factors which change things really on a qualitative and quantitative basis. So our argument is that there really was a single system, but it takes quite a long time to emerge. It was initially relatively disparate, and it only gradually coalesced, and that is across this sort of 130 odd years or so. And it was influenced by pre-existing commercial and banking networks, but also by warfare and broader historical changes. One key factor was the emergence of the kind of hubs that I've just been outlining as stable fixed markets for fiscal military transactions. And this was one aspect marking a departure from later medieval practice of temporary mobile trade fairs and itinerant monarchs who were engaged in almost perpetual royal progresses. So there's a fixed geographical specificity which emerges. There's also sharply growing demands for warfare, which determined which of those cities became hubs for this type of business, because being in a particular location mattered. In addition, there were the transnational connections being forged by dynasticism, notably the emergence of the Habsburgs. So you can see here, this is a map, the green on the map shows Habsburg territory at its height in the middle of the 16th century. So the rapid accumulation of these kind of dynastic conglomerates or composite states, they go by various different ways, which on the one hand increases strength of those powers, but also multiplies their number of potential enemies, and it increases the geographical spread of their interests. And this development was linked to and happened concurrently with the Reformation, the first permanent schism in European Christianity since the 11th century, which forged new kind of connections across the continent between peoples who previously had very little to do with each other. So, for example, it mattered to 16th and early 17th century Londoners what was happening in Transylvania. And these kind of factors are already apparent in the religiously inflected civil wars of the later second half of the 16th century. Wars were being fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, requiring a coordination of resource allocation and the movement of troops and supplies to different theatres. And although these conflicts were, of course, punctuated by periods of peace, they dragged across many consecutive years. Virtually all of the struggles in the 16th century combine elements of what we would regard as international war with civil war, and much of that was stirred by the new confessional antagonism. And that exacerbated the already difficult task of mobilizing resources. So monarchs were often opposed by significant proportions of their subjects and needing to turn to alternative sources of supply. Changes of weaponry and tactics are the sort of things that are usually summarized by the frame of the military revolution, as well as clashes between differently armed and differently organized opponents, all heighten the desire to obtain better quality troops. And some regions acquired reputations for supplying superior forces, such as the Swiss, German, or Bohemian infantry, or the Balkan light cavalry. Meanwhile, the limited administrative capacity of most states made it expedient often to hire forces or to purchase supplies in or near the war zone, rather than having to raise them internally and then move or transport them to where they were needed. So the basic practices mediated through different forms of contract, which our project is trying to determine and to work out, these were already had then emerged in the late 16th, early 17th century, but it's really the development of permanent forces, which is a feature of the last third or maybe 40 years or so of the 17th century, that helps the consolidation of this, and it also sees the integration of this within what it would then now talk properly as a common system. From this point on, so from the late 17th century onwards, armed forces were truly permanent and were composed of units that remain continuously in existence both in peace as well as wartime. And that, of course, increases demand. If we look at the structure of armed forces, Europe's armed forces in this period, they really adopted what I would call a cadre system, whereby units were retained in peacetime on a reduced establishment to be expanded when hostilities resumed. And foreign auxiliaries in this context, at least ostensibly, they were already trained and equipped, and they appeared to offer a good way of mobilizing quickly, what one of the researchers on the project has termed the surge state. So the ability to gain that advantage by mobilizing quickly by essentially hiring troops who are already in the war zone where you want to fight or conveniently placed. Access to foreign manpower and money often enabled states to mobilize faster than they could if they were relying on their own populations. So in other words, autarky in this sense was not necessarily invariably superior. Foreign manpower could be recruited also directly into national forces by establishing foreign regiments, and the figures you can see on the screen represent the English, Irish and Scottish troops who are in Spanish service in the 1680s. Sometimes foreigners were incorporated into special elite units, such as the Swiss, who were serving the French, Spanish and Dutch forces, but they could also be hired more easily than indigenous units. So certainly hired and fired, so the kind of the other end of the spectrum being treated more as cannon fodder. It's much easier to get rid of foreign troops. You can return them home. There are no welfare issues. There's no pensions to pay in this period, although they do come in later. Much easier to disband and reduce your troops than to reduce units which have been raised by your indigenous aristocracy who have sunk their political and economic capital into the units that they've raised. So there are definite qualitative and quantitative advantages. That increases the demand. We also have increased supply. The new understanding of sovereignty that emerges after the Westphalian settlement endangers Europe's semi-sovereigns, who were the princes of the Holy Roman Empire, the Italian principalities, and so on, who are in danger of losing what I would call their treatable status. So being recognized as a sovereign in this in the European state system that is becoming more clearly defined by what we would term modern sovereignty. So to give you a key example of this, where we can see this transition in play, if we look at the peace settlements that end the War of Spanish Succession, this is in 1713, 1714, the Duke of Lorraine petitions to be represented at the peace settlement. This is a prince who'd been previously recognized by both France and the Holy Roman Empire as sovereign, and he's politely shown the door, whereas the Elector of Brandenburg is recognized now as the king in Prussia. Thanks to his agreement with the emperor who has given him this title, he's treated as a sovereign in return for having provided troops during the war, and he's allowed to join the Peace Congress, being regarded as treatable and having the political influence that goes with that. So the desire, in other words, to engage in the system, in international relations in this way, in this point of transition, increases the desire or to make yourself useful. And one of the ways you can do that is to provide troops to assist in these wars, which are all coalition wars. No power fights on its own. All the wars are waged by coalitions of major and minor powers, with often the major powers subsidizing the involvement of the minor powers who provide troops, but they also provided supplies and they provided access across territory and strategic locations, access to fortresses, for example. So the conflicts that are taking place in this period help to integrate the various subsystems that we've seen emerging in the 16th and early 17th century. And Britain does play quite an important role here. Britain's transition from a supplier of manpower in the 17th century, in the first half of the 17th century, to being a major consumer of both of foreign manpower, really, in after 1688 is a major factor. The fact that Britain is in alliance with the Dutch Republic, the other commercially capable potent power of the period, links the two commercial hubs of Europe, London and Amsterdam, together. And these are really the powerhouse of the anti-French coalitions, which last into the middle of the 18th century. It's also in this period that Vienna, which is also linked politically to the Grand Alliance against France, so as the Habsburg capital, is the key coordinating hub for mobilizing much of the manpower that is being provided by Central Europe. Meanwhile, the Great Northern War is being waged in the Baltic. This is in the first 20 years of the 18th century, which sees Russia emerge, I mean, partly through its conquests, but also to facilitate those conquests and to develop the capacity, for example, to create a Baltic Navy once you've got access, seeking foreign expertise, particularly Dutch and British expertise, so bringing in the Baltic region as obviously a supplier of so-called naval stores, which are essential to maintain European navies. So we see the consolidation of the system then by about 1730. During the 18th century, I would say this is really more the maturity of what is going on. Standardized practices, there's very little innovation across this period. We do get the development of tradable national debt, which sees the development of foreign investment in national debt. So some of the Swiss cantons, for example, are buying sections of Britain's national debt by the 1720s. But other than that, there's really no particular significant innovations. On the system that had been developed by the 1720s facilitates the major wars of the middle of the 18th century waged between 1733 and 1763. These again waged by rival coalitions, relying heavily on foreign manpower, subsidies and loans. And throughout this, I mean, normally if you look at the 18th century, you see the one power that is usually singled out, which is Prussia. And we have the example here. This is James Kirkland, who, depending on how you convert a Prussian feet and inches, was probably well over 7 foot, who was persuaded to join the Prussian army. And of course, the Prussian army has this unit of tall, particularly tall grenadiers, the giant grenadiers. And it's always seen as a kind of oddity, you know, that Prussia has this, but otherwise our picture of Prussia is really as the autarkic state. This is really where the Prussian monarchy literally has barrels of gold coins in the palace vaults and relies on its own resources, in other words, to fight. And Prussia, of course, is the one state that joins the ranks of the great powers and seems to be a great success. But Prussia's striving for autarky was sort of, one might say, neo-medieval in a world which is modernizing. So it really is trying to live off its own. It doesn't develop a credit system, and it certainly doesn't develop very good access to European credit or indeed foreign manpower. It relies on manpower, certainly, but it has no substitute when the supply of that manpower is cut off by about 1800. So Prussia, which fights only a very limited war in the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, and this is sufficient to bankrupt it and force it into 10 years of neutrality. So Prussia, I think, is the case which actually demonstrates the dangers of relying on the kind of autarky and not really engaging with the system in the way in which other powers had done. So the zenith of the system is really during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, which also sees the onset of its demise. The revolutionary ideology of the citizens in arms, so the kind of thing that you can see being expressed in the painting on the screen, as well as the revolution's assault on social and geographical privileges, greatly expanded the state's war-making potential by removing the various legal barriers to the mobilization of human and material resources. Simultaneously, the greater reach of the state was legitimated by new ideologies, especially the idea of national sovereignty, which expands the state's ability to both command national resources, but also delegitimize, or at least discourages, reliance on foreigners. So there is a much sharper division. A number of people, Mike Rapport and others, have written on the changing ideas of what it means to be French, and the fact that this now has to be legally defined in ways in which under the old regime things were left very much more blurred and fuzzy. France disbands its foreign regiments in 1792, but in fact swiftly had to resume foreign recruitment. But if we look at French methods under the Republic and then under Napoleon, these I would say are very much classically imperial, rather than those of the fiscal military system. France simply requisitioned resources, or it imposed them as tribute from defeated or allied states. By contrast, France's enemies are trying to make the old way of transferring resources work. And in doing so, they are ultimately successful after a number, obviously, of struggles. But all the coalitions relied to some considerable extent on subsidies and on the hire of foreign manpower. And certainly it is in this period where the French occupation of Amsterdam, 1795, basically damages that city's position as Europe's financial capital, and we see a transition to London, and London is really the centre for funneling much of the money, but also the material resources to sustain the anti-French coalitions. So the fate of the system after 1815 mirrors, I think, the Restoration era more broadly. Many of the underlying structures were still there, but the prolonged warfare and the changes of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era had nonetheless profoundly altered conditions. The most obvious of the changes was the demise, not completely, but certainly significant reduction of the semi-sovereign powers. So the German principalities, the Italian states, these have been to some considerable extent consolidated. There are now far fewer medium and smaller states within Europe, and moreover, they are now fully sovereign rather than occupying this slightly ambiguous status that they'd had before. The treaties also articulated new ideas of neutrality. So Switzerland is now formally neutral, and neutrality takes on a very different view. It's more clearly codified. So the idea of trading with all belligerents and so on is delegitimized. So the changed attitudes to neutrality, and these are extended obviously once Belgium is a separate country. This, I think, is another significant shift. However, the kind of desire to change everything is somewhat reduced by the fact that everyone is trying to cash in on the peace dividend. There's an enormous surplus of weaponry. For example, armies are drastically reduced after 1815. So there is less urgency to sort of change the ways in which things have been done. And there is still a legacy of the old system beforehand. So the restructured militaries of post-1815 Europe are still largely a cadre system, relying, broadly speaking, on a very limited number of long service conscripts. And there is still an interest in hiring foreign manpower. So both France and the Netherlands recruited new foreign regiments after 1816, and they're followed, for example, by Naples. So the man you can see on the screen there is actually the Swiss in Neapolitan service. Now, as I say, some of the conditions had changed, and the cooperation that we saw in order to exchange resources prior to 1815 gradually shifts over to cooperation to delegitimate that. So even the dismantling of the system is also reliant on cooperation. And that is seen after 1815 through curbing what is known as extraterritorial violence. So the way in which somebody from Switzerland could join the Neapolitan army increasingly becomes subject to restrictions. The institutional developments since the 1790s make those restrictions easier to enforce, while the new rhetoric of national sovereignty undermines much of the legitimacy of those practices which they'd had before. So whereas going off to fight in another army was in early modern Europe usually seen as a right, as a privilege, now this is illegal, and it's expressly cast as that, most famously in Britain's case by the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819, which is introduced under pressure from Spain. So again, this shows you how this is done. So the Enlistment Act is imposed in 1819 to stop the recruitment by the revolutionary governments of what become the South American states, who are fighting their wars of independence, and they're trying to recruit men discharged after the Napoleonic Wars. Governments also cooperated on cartels. These are extradition treaties to extradite deserters, which implicitly renounce the right to recruit foreigners, and they acted together with the Declaration of Paris. This is under pressure from commercial interests, the Declaration of Paris of 1856, which banned privateering. And the renewed revolutionary upheavals of 1830 and 1848 in particular accelerated this. It burnished the credentials of the citizen, the motivated citizen in arms, relative to the foreign soldier, who's now increasingly called the foreign mercenary. And that led directly to the scene that you saw at the opening of the presentation, where the Swiss are again attacked in France. And immediately after the revolution of 1830, the Swiss regiments are returned, and France recasts its foreign troops as the French Foreign Legion, who are of course serving overseas and not in metropolitan France. So the final dismantling of the system is over the next couple of decades or so. This again has a number of reasons. The reorientation of Britain's finances away from investment on the continent, so funding the debt of the newly independent Latin American countries becomes the great investment opportunity of the 1820s and 1830s, as well as increasingly funding the development of Britain's own empire. The emergence of joint stock companies create new opportunities with the acceleration of industrialization, which also drew off capital, which otherwise might have been funneled towards Europe. And the Crimean War really sees the last gasp of Britain's engagement with the formation of German, Swiss, and Italian foreign legions, which were to be sent to the Crimea, but ultimately some of them get sent to help populate South Africa. In continental Europe, there are changes too. Britain's withdrawal from the system, of course, cuts off both the supply and the demand. Britain is not hiring foreign troops anymore, and it's not paying for them. Industrialization, meanwhile, is boosting productivity and offers the prospect of substituting machinery for human labor, thereby freeing men to serve for national defense. The revised conscription laws, which sweep Europe around about 1870, eliminate some of the remaining exemptions, and they replace the relatively ineffective National Guards that had existed with much more efficient reservist systems, so enabling that surge state capacity to mobilize quickly. Mobilization times are drastically being cut in this period. Meanwhile, overseas imperial expansion opened access to new war-making resources, notably non-European military labor, which are deployed to both defend and extend empire, but already France has used colonial troops to fight a European war in the 1850s in the Crimea, and of course will do so again in 1870 when it's under attack by Germany. The processes of German and Italian unification, so-called, remove the remaining small powers like Naples, Sicily, and the Papal States, which are really the last to employ significant proportions of foreign troops. And foreign soldiering is also being, again, ideologically reworked. So in place of the foreign mercenary, we now have the supposedly motivated foreign fighter typified by the Garibaldini, who you can see there on the screen. So somebody who serves for a cause, supposedly, rather than pay, although I'm somewhat skeptical about just how significant that was as a transition. So after 1870, well, of course, wars are still fought by alliances, but these are really now very much between sovereign states. So the kind of non-state actor type figure or semi-states are really removed. And this continues, I think I would see the era of nationalized war making really lasting until the Second World War, or a bit later perhaps, which reveals new limits to the national sovereign war making in a globalized international order. Clearly the arms trade persists, and it does so in a very different form. It's now more tightly regulated, even if it remained largely beyond democratic control in most European states. And aid was provided to other states, but now that is very much more linked to foreign policy. So with the development of military missions and targeted arms sales. So the individuals that you can see there who look like Prussians are in fact Chileans, and they're from 1879, and they're wearing German helmets, which have just been captured from the Peruvians that they defeated in the War of the Pacific, that were still buried, had the German Imperial Eagle that had just been sold to the Peruvian army. So you can see some of the kind of dissemination and so on, but these were very much connected to targeted military missions, which are often linked very much connected to arms sales and so on, as advancing foreign and economic policies simultaneously. So what does all of this tell us? Well, I would say that I think the project is showing that there was the emergence of a single system in the sense of something of interdependent parts, which served a specific function in the facilitating of the exchange of scarce war-making resources. Its development was integral to the development of Europe as a sovereign state system, since the components of that system needed reliable ways of cooperating despite their suspicions and rivalries. And the fiscal military system declined as the growing nationalisation of warfare rendered it functionally redundant. And our argument here is that this system was unique to pre-modern Europe. The project doesn't claim to have found some kind of new universal model that can be applied to other times and places, such as the fiscal military state has been so associated first with John Brewer, but for example, recently applied to Ethiopia. So we don't argue that. We think that it is time and place specific. And we also, looking ahead, we argue, or we're beginning to argue, that the era of fully nationalized modern warfare is proving historically comparatively brief. It already gave way, certainly by 1990, to what we might label a postmodern and increasingly post-national war making, which is becoming more reliant on private military and security companies, in which armed non-state actors have assumed a considerable importance. And just to illustrate just how complex the present situation is, the individuals you can see there on the screen are men of the so-called Wagner group, or Wagner group, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So this is sometimes termed a private military and security company. It's based in Russia. It has close relations to the Russian oligarchs and to the Russian government, especially to Putin. It doesn't, however, operate in the same way as a commercial company does. So it's not like Blackwater, although it's often compared to them. And it's actually technically illegal in Russia. So exactly where that sits, this kind of hybridity, which is often being pronounced, shows you just the kind of complexities of the present day situation. So I think that the people who are talking about the return of the mercenary to describe the present situation are wrong, because the present situation is definitely not the same. But I do think that by studying pre-modern Europe, and by looking at the role of what we might loosely call private actors and this kind of transnational exchange of war-making materials in an era where state sovereignty was forming, because we're now seeing, I think, the opposite of that, I think can shed some interesting lights on our present-day troubles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Could you join me with a virtual hand clap? And thanks there. Thank you for a very interesting talk. We have about, I think, 20 odd minutes for questions. Because we've got such a great turnout, and I think this is the largest turnout we've had at a CRAM lecture, I can't actually see everybody on my screen at the moment. So maybe it's best, I'm looking at Thomas here, if people type their questions into the chat and then I pose them. Would that work best, Thomas? Yeah, okay. So if you have a question for Peter, could you put it in the chat and I will collect a few of them and pose them to Peter. Imagine there's feverish typing going on, Peter, now. While we wait for some of the questions to come in, I might abuse my position as a host and pose my own verbal question. So I'm particularly interested in that turning point, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period. And as you were well aware, there's a long debate to the extent to which that represents a suzerain in the conduct of war. And I just wondered where your project sat in that sort of debate on the conflict between the 1790s and the 1800s. Is that accelerating the breakup of this system that you've described, or not? Where would you put more emphasis on continuity leading into the early decades of the 19th century?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a turning point in some respects. I mean, the anti-French coalition, for them, they start off, it's business as usual. You know, revolutionary France is Louis XIV again, and it's attacking in exactly the same geographic areas. And the anti-French coalition is composed of the same sort of states, and they try to fight it in the same kind of way, and it doesn't work. And there are a whole lot of reasons for the reasons why it doesn't work, and they're not actually to do with the fiscal military system that was delivering the type of resources that would have been adequate to have waged the wars in which they were waged before. But the French are fighting in a different way, and the French have really ripped up the rule book, which is one of the reasons I think why they are actually forced to fight in an imperialistic way, because they cannot, once they're running out of their own resources, then they can't raise them in the way that Bourbon France would have tried to do. And this is, I think, another factor that pushes them in you know, first of all, create satellites to do the job for you, and then you take them over and run them in this sort of imperialist kind of way. So, but ultimately that France is defeated and we get a return, but I think that it can't be business as usual after 1815. And so I tried to show there are some elements that sort of slot back into place, but the ideological underpinnings of the way in which resources were being exchanged before, and the legitimacy of somebody going off to fight for a foreign power, that a lot of that has been kicked away, not completely, and that takes obviously the changes of the next 50, 60 years to more or less complete and to fully nationalize warfare. But everyone is hoping really to go back to an age of minimal conflict, and are not seeking actually to try to fight again on quite the same scale that they were in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era, which, if I can just add one more point, is actually proportionately to population not as big as the wars of the late 17th and the early 18th century.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Can I ask about the wider economic impacts of this? I mean, you alluded to kind of some of the connections with industrialization. Should we see this as a key driver of industrialization across Europe? But also, sort of, to what extent was it a driver of the slow growth of state taxation? You know, is this really fundamental to the whole economy, I suppose I'm asking?
Right. That's a good question, because I haven't thought about it so much from the 19th century point of view. I mean, I think that, you know, industrialization and so on, obviously it's a huge debate in itself, but I don't think that warfare really is driving that. I mean, yes, you need to have certain types of precision machinery and so on, and I think that's more, there's a certain desire to create that type of machinery by the 1850s, and it enables certain types of weaponry and so on to be introduced. But and then obviously that that later 19th century arms trade is very much based on that, because once you've tooled your factory up, you have to find clients, and there's a kind of different way of doing it. Arms production was much more decentralized in early modern Europe, at least. Small arms production certainly was. Shipbuilding is a somewhat different matter. But I think that what we're seeing really is well, there's two things. We're seeing, one, the way in which commercial practices are being purposed for the exchange of military resources or war-making resources. So forms of credit, for example, which are developing in the 15th century, are fairly rapidly used to ensure that soldiers that are serving far away can be paid, and you don't actually have to ship barrels of coin out to do it. And so that's where we see a kind of sort of symbiotic effect, or particularly the military more as a kind of parasitic. They adopting, as I say, particular practices and purposing them to enable this. And that raises, of course, a question as to how far this is just business, and these kind of cultural and moral questions are there. So, for example, I was talking today, Kathleen Saati, who is doing the Baltic study, was talking about how it's quite common to find just a couple of barrels of gunpowder on a ship that's otherwise carrying Baltic grain, which suggests it's like just business as usual. Well, we've got a bit of spare capacity, and this is a high value product, and we'll put it on board. But it's one of the things we're still grappling with.
Thank you, Peter. We've got a few questions in the chat. So I've got 3 questions from Regina. The first: does the project capture illicit trade and finance as a factor for resourcing armies and sometimes states? Second, how about Jewish banking networks which extended beyond Europe, such as Oppenhauer, for instance? And third, how does the project negotiate the issues of changing political maps and its implications for the concept of interstate transnational support? And she uses the example of the Netherlands or Lombardy here.
Right. So illicit, this is one of the things as to what is legal and what isn't. So it's very blurred, and I think it's a kind of resonance with the contemporary world. So recruitment might be officially banned in one location, but you have officers from that location who are serving in regiments which are integral in another army, and of course they are allowed to recruit. So this sort of thing, these kind of boundaries are constantly being blurred, but also can suddenly become hard if it suits the local authorities to do so. So there's a sort of legal flexibility here too. And some of the hubs, so Geneva is a good example. I mean, it's used as a sort of banking recruitment center. It's also the major way in which counterfeit coin and counterfeit goods are being smuggled into France. So there's connections with those things. So the second question, sorry, I've you have to remind me of that.
How about Jewish banking network?
Oh yes, yeah. That is one of the things, as you might expect, because this is for in other kinds of trade too. Yes, you get diaspora groups are very significant. So Jewish financiers are very prominent because they have the kind of social pressure that you can put to enforce compliance with contracts. So how do you? This is a high risk business, and how do you ensure compliance with contracts? Well, within a kind of religious or social group, you have these kind of additional non-economic sanctions, which can be very important. But there are other diaspora groups. I mean, Protestant refugee groups, for example, being very important in the development of Amsterdam, and so on. So we're finding quite a lot of evidence of that too. And the third question I didn't quite follow. It was about maps, was it?
How does the project negotiate issues of the changing political map and its implications for the concept of interstate and transnational support?
Yeah, Well, again, I mean, I guess if you view this in terms of boundaries, I mean, I think it's that there are, you know, the understanding of boundaries changes, and that's a slow process. And part of it is cartographic, so the way boundaries are being represented in maps, which I think is part and parcel also of a kind of mental shift. But I think that that's something which is coming in. Crystallizing in its more modern form around the end of the 18th century. So, you know, I think that fits in with the timing of where we think the other changes are.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So we have a question here from Jacob. How far is the legacy of these shifting foreign fighters still seen today in today's geopolitical landscape? For example, in the French Foreign Legion, the Papal Swiss Guard. Could you argue there are further, more muted legacies throughout Europe and the wider world?
Yeah, I mean, the Papal Swiss Guard they're given a special dispensation. So the Swiss constitution is changed after the Swiss Civil War of 1847 to ban further contracts, and the last contracts are terminated in the 1850s, with the exception of the Swiss Guard. So what happens is there's a liminal stage in the sort of 1850s, 1860s where regiments which would have been nationally designated, so Swiss or German or something like that, become foreign, which of course is a way in which you can join them. And the French have already done this. So the French have German and Swiss regiments, and then after 1830, 31, it becomes the Foreign Legion. And, you know, the Legion obviously cultivates this. Officially, there are quotas, you know, not more than a quarter of legionaries are supposed to be from any particular nationality, but, you know, you kind of lose your nationality when you join the Foreign Legion. So there have been these, you know, there's a shift in order to ensure continued legality. And I mean, these organizations have, you know, these units are, of course, problematic legally. So one of the reasons why Britain and France don't sign up to the UN ban on mercenaries is the status of whether these count as foreign mercenaries or not.
Okay, thank you. We have next question is from Gavin Rand. He wonders if you could say a bit more about how empire fits into the story, and especially how the fact of empire and imperial resources relates to geographical and chronological limits you described in the paper.
Yeah.
Did the European system you described depend on imperial resources, or was the latter incidental to the core features?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I'm still wrestling with that, because I think we're trying to quantify it to assess the importance. I mean, so in some senses, extra European resources are very important. So Britain's access to saltpeter and that's from India, is hugely important in the development of and the autarky that Britain actually develops in gunpowder production. So that's a very good example where non-European resources at a fairly early stage become very important in European warfare. But it's actually quite difficult to think of very many more. So I tend to see the non-European resources which are being obtained by the process of empire are consumed by that process. So you know, France is pretty exceptional in deploying colonial troops in Europe and before the First World War, and it's actually you know, I think that the European powers are able, in other words, to expand their empires with relatively minimal human and even material resources. Financial resources is a different matter. I mean, the German Empire, of course, never made any money and costs an enormous subsidy to maintain. But the other empires it's the Europeans' ability to exploit indigenous resources outside Europe that enables that imperial expansion. I would say, seems to me anyway.
And thanks for that. And John France is a comment or a question, John. One of the outcomes of the debate on the military revolution is a discussion of where the dynamic of change resided. Was it in the military or an inbuilt tendency towards state building?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the original military revolution arguments that were pushed in the sort of 1970s and so on technology, I think do have a place. I mean, quite clearly there are certain technological revolutions that help the development of effective infantry, so from the sort of 1450s, 1470s, and these are also linked to improved metallurgy and you know, improved gunpowder manufacture. So there are also economic changes too, and there are certainly, I see that feeding in. I mean, the production of some of these weaponry is highly specialized, and the desire of states to try to monopolize that, but that doesn't always lead to that result. So we don't actually get, so classically it's artillery, you know, sort of artillery becomes a state monopoly and so forth, and that's partly true, but large parts of Europe, the state is actually relying on artillery that is produced and held by important cities. And when arms are confiscated in the Napoleonic era in Württemberg, so everyone has to hand over their arms to the state. No fewer than over 200 cannon in private ownership are handed over. So I'm sort of slightly skeptical about, you know, the original teleology in the military revolution argument.
Excellent. I've got one more question, but maybe it's a little unfair because it relates to the period after 1870. But you seem to be suggesting in the conclusions that the era of nationalised wars might turn out to actually be very, very brief. So I wonder what you think of the kind of new wars debate that Mary Calder, or the argument that Mary Calder has made, that, you know, post particularly 1989, we're in a period of what she calls new wars, where increasingly you get non-state or quasi-state actors or private companies engaging in
yeah, I mean, I think the new is new, because I don't think that we can't draw sort of linear connections to pre-modernity. So a number of people have sort of seen, like the European trading companies, the Dutch East India Company or the English East India Company, as kind of like the first kind of modern private military and security companies. And I don't think so. I think that they operated in a different way, and the kind of what is new is the sort of the way in which companies are free of geographical location. So the way that many of these companies are able to operate virtually, so they might have a physical office somewhere, but they're able to sort of shift their operations. The way that they recruit is very decentralized as well. So the manpower, I mean, the Wagner Group, for example, recruit many non-Russians. Many of the kind of personnel of the various private companies operating in Africa rely on ex-Latin American special forces who've been recruited. So this sort of stuff which is done disconnected from states as well, in a way which I think there's a relationship to sovereign power, or would-be sovereign power, in early modernity, which is we're not seeing so much today, and which is why I sort of have a hunch that things are moving in the opposite direction of the developments that I'm trying to trace.
Thank you. Are there any other last questions for Peter? No, I think that's it. Well, let me please, I would like everyone to join me in thanking Peter again for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed that. It was great to get the long perspective on these events as well. So thank you once again for a really, really interesting talk.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you also for the questions. Yeah, very good.
Thank you. This session is being recorded, and we will look to upload it onto our website in some shape or form in due course. So thank you everybody for participating, and thanks again to Peter for the talk.
Okay, thanks, Em.
Bye.